Hey guys, welcome to the No Bro Approach, where I help you to cut through all the confusion behind all things exercise and nutrition related and leave out the bro science. As always, before we get into it, I want to remind you that I don't know everything, different things are going to work for different people, and science is always changing. So take everything that I say with a grain of salt and do your own research. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. Today I'm going to be going through training frequency and helping you to figure out the right amount of training frequency for you. To help with this, we're going to be using an article by Gentile P done in 2018, where they went through their own study but also looked at a few different studies comparing once a week, twice a week, and 3 times a week of training frequency. Now, the first one that they looked at was more focused on strength. So they were comparing the effects of once per week training to 3 times per week training on maximum strength. And they found that the group that trained 3 times a week ended up with a higher increase in maximum strength at the end. What they did note in the study, though, is that the people that were only performing once a week training did have a higher strength baseline at the start, meaning that they were already close to or closer to their limit, so it was harder for them to increase strength. The next one they noted was by Schoenfeld et al. In 2015. They had a higher focus on muscular hypertrophy. And again in this study, they found that the 3 times a week group ended up with a greater increase in elbow flexor muscle thickness than the ones that are only training once a week, but they found no difference in elbow extensor thickness. Now, moving on to the study that I actually did in this article that I read through. So in this study, they had 20 male college students who were at least 18 years of age and had 12 months of training experience before they did this study. During this study, the participants were instructed that they had to complete at least 80% of the training sessions, and they were not allowed to change any part of their current nutritional intake. So they weren't allowed to go vegetarian, they weren't allowed to go on any crazy diets or decrease their calorie intake. They had to keep all that the same. And all participants in this study already had experience of training 2 to 3 times a week. Now, what they ended up doing was they divided these 20 participants, into 2 groups. They had one that was only training once a week on Monday, and the second group was training twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, training the same muscle group twice a week or once a week. Both of these groups performed the same amount of exercises, the same amount of sets, and the same amount of reps. So they were trying to keep everything as similar as possible between the 2 groups. And they were instructed to perform 3 sets, 8 to 12 reps, and they're instructed to go to complete momentary muscular concentric failure. So in layman's terms, they were instructed to go to the point where they can't lift the weight anymore. And then they were given a rest interval of 2 minutes. Now, before we go any further, there is an issue that I have here already. And unfortunately, it's not really something they can get around unless they have clones. So what I'm talking about is there's no true way for them to match volume with this, especially if going to failure, because each participant is going to have a little bit of different strength, especially as they go through the study. Each person will progress at different rates. So what I mean is, if they're doing bicep curl, for instance, and they're all going to 12 reps at failure, one person may be completing failure using 20 kilos, whereas the next may be doing it at 30 kilos because they're going to have different levels of strength. Therefore, the volume won't be the same. And unfortunately, as I said, there's no real way to get around this because each person is going to develop at a different rate and each person is going to start at a different level of strength as well. So unless you have the exact same person or as I said at the start, clones, there's no ways to get around this. So let's continue on and go through the rest of the study anyway. What they did find in this study is that the people participating in only once a week training increased their elbow thickness. It wasn't a massive increase, but they did increase it more than the ones that were performing these exercises twice a week. As soon as I saw this, and they actually talked about it later in the article as well, my first thought was that because these people have only been training for 12 months, people that start out training tend to push themselves harder than they need to. meaning they get to an overreaching phase, or as a lot of people know it, overtraining. But overreaching is kind of just before that point where you get to overtraining. So it means that you're getting to the point where the muscular breakdown accumulates over time, meaning that, so let's say you're training for 8 weeks and your breakdown, it keeps going down, so the muscle's breaking down over time, and then you don't give yourself sufficient amount of time to rest and recover for it to build back up, so you go into your next 8-week block and it keeps breaking down again. So what I thought straight away was they probably got to that point where they're at overreaching, so dialing it down or going to once a week meant that they had more time to recover between training that same muscle group, meaning that they would have been able to get through that overreaching phase and the muscle would have had time to build up and go back to normal or get stronger. Another thing they talked about further down in the study, and they referenced a article by Chelsea et al. 2012, was the fact that after training, your protein synthesis levels increase, but they only increase for a certain amount of time, meaning that more frequency would be optimal for this factor. Because let's look at it like this. So if you have your protein synthesis spikes after doing a training session, and then it comes back down again, so you want to train again at that point to get that spike, and it comes back down again. And I'll actually talk about a graph that I'll show up in the corner showing the muscular breakdown after each session as well. And in this, what I'm trying to get at is it's very hard to know the exact amount of volume that you need in order to recover before you train again. So if you're doing one session a week, your muscle will break down during that session, and then it will start to get stronger and you'll have the supercompensation period. But if you don't train it again fast enough before it goes, so it'll go up to supercompensation, and if you don't train it fast enough, it'll go back to your baseline. So it's very hard to tell when the exact point is that you need to train that muscle again when you get to that supercompensation period. So it will require a little bit of playing around because each person is going to be different. So what I'd recommend, and even just learning a little bit from this study, is to trial both approaches. So trial doing once a week, do that for 8 weeks, and then have a deload week between, and then trial twice a week, doing that for 8 weeks as well. Learning from this study, what you should be doing is limiting as many different variables as possible. So try to keep the exercise the same, try to keep the reps the same, the sets the same, keep your nutrition optimal, and try to keep your rest period the same as well. So remove as many variables as possible and measure yourself at the start of each 8-week block and at the end of each 8-week block and see which one you responded better to. While this is not perfect because there's so many different variables in there, you may have a few weeks where your nutrition is not quite on point. You may have had something come up between the sessions, as you may not have been sleeping as much. There's a lot of different variables to consider there. And while it's not the most accurate way to do it, it's still going to be a pretty good approach to figure out what's going to be best for you. Another thing to consider as well is what's going to work best for your lifestyle. You may only have time to train each muscle group once a week. And if so, that's fine. We can learn from this study that it is actually an approach that you can still take. Something is better than nothing. So if you can't train 3 times a week or 2 times a week, then just do the once a week and add a little bit extra volume so you're still getting the training stimulus that you need to break down the muscle fibers and recover before you train that same muscle group again the following week. One other thing that they should have factored in here as well, I think, is even though they said don't change your current nutritional intake, some of the participants may have had a terrible intake in the first place. So they may have continued that terrible intake. I think what they should have done is looked at what they are currently having, optimize that first, run it for a few weeks, and then start the trial from there to make sure that each client or each participant, was on optimized intakes. If you want my personal opinion, if you have time for it, I recommend doing twice, if not 3 times a week. And the reason for that is twofold. One, because of the graph I showed you earlier. And then the second one is because you're going to have the fatigue factor if you have to fit a lot of exercises into one day. So, for instance, if you're training chest and you're only doing once a week, you may have to fit 5 chest exercises in there, if not more, to make up for the fact that you can't split that up between 2 or 3 days a week. So, for instance, if you may have to do bench press, followed by chest flies, followed by push-ups, followed by dips, and followed by some dumbbell flies to finish it off at the end there. By the time you get to those dips and those dumbbell flies, you're going to be wrecked. You're not going to have much left in the tank, meaning you won't be able to push out as much weight or as many reps or as many sets as you may have if you had split that up between 2 or 3 different days. So that's my personal opinion. But again, it comes down to lifestyle, and that still isn't going to work the best for everyone because everybody's body's a little bit different. I would do what I recommended earlier. Try the 2 different approaches. Give each one 8 weeks and see which one works best for A, your lifestyle, and for B, your results. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to a few things. Your lifestyle, what's going to fit into your life best, what you respond best to personally, and which you prefer. Because you still have to consider your personal preference and what you're actually going to do more often. Because if you don't like having to jam so many things in one day and you're not going to keep doing that week in, week out, it's not going to be the best approach for you. If you prefer to split it up between 2 or 3 days and you find that you're going to be able to do that more consistently, that will be the best approach for you. Now, if you got something out of this video, please hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments below what your personal preference is, or if you try this approach of trying each one for 8 weeks, let me know which one worked best for you. Thank you for listening, guys, and I'll talk to you in the next video.